With a few weeks left until the NHL trade deadline, even though we've seen a couple of big trades already, there are still so many players out there that have yet to be dealt. Hello guys, today we're taking a look at the 10 most likely players to be dealt at this year's NHL trade deadline. So who could your team end up acquiring and who will be gone by the trade deadline? Watch till the end for the complete list and hit that subscribe button if you're new. Now, even though we've seen the big trades in Bo Horvat and Vladimir Tarasenko, there's still so much quality out there that is yet to be dealt. And let's talk about that quality and go on to the 10th most likely player to be traded at this year's deadline in the Arizona Coyotes star defenseman in Jakob Chychrun. Now, it feels like we've been talking about Chychrun forever now, and that's really been the case. He's been in trade rumors for like 3 years now, and considering his contract, he still has a ton of value on the market, and that ton of value is the reason why he hasn't been dealt. That steep asking price that the Coyotes have reportedly had has really kept a Chychrun trade from happening. And that's why he's also lower on this list, but this year of Arizona, in 36 games, he has 7 goals, 21 assists for 28 points. It seems like some years he's better defensively, some years he's better offensively, but if he does put it all together, he's a top 15 dual threat guy and would be extremely valuable for any NHL team. And if he is dealt, I can see the Boston Bruins likely being the favorites here alongside Toronto and maybe even a dark horse team here in the Detroit Red Wings. Next up on the list here, let's go on to the 9th most likely player to be dealt at the trade deadline. And next up, I have from the Philadelphia Flyers in James Van Riemsdyk, who is a really interesting piece at this year's deadline, mostly because of the cap hit situation. He makes $7 million and will be UFA after this year, but even at 50% retained, that cap hit makes it a little bit less likely that he's dealt. Still though, age 33, this year in 35 games, he has 9 goals, 13 assists, 22 points, and even though he's gone a little bit cold in these past couple of weeks, I think in a playoff contender with some major motivation, James Van Riemsdyk could be a great power play, great net front presence, and I think a lot of teams out there would especially love him. In the Central Division, I think there will be a lot of teams interested in him, mostly the Jets, the Avs, and the Minnesota Wild. Next up at number 8, let's go on to one of the most interesting cases at the deadline this year in Vladislav Gavrikov of the Columbus Blue Jackets, who would be probably my top 3 if it weren't for the asking price that Columbus is giving out right now. As for the asking price, it's a first, a third, and a fourth. And even though I likely see that coming down, to me that is a steep asking price for a rental defenseman that isn't perfect whatsoever. And he's a player that, although I think a lot of teams would be interested in, mainly the Bruins, Canes, and maybe even the Calgary Flames, if they're going for a big trade inland acquisition, as a penalty kill, decent offensive guy, Gavrikov is solid, but that asking price might be the only thing that keeps a trade from happening. But even so, I could see a true contender like the Boston Bruins swallowing that asking price and being okay with it. Next up, let's move on to number 7 and go on to another Arizona Coyotes defenseman, this time a little bit less risky and probably a lot cheaper too, in Shane Gostisbehere, who, unlike Jakob Chychrun, is only going to be a rental at $4.5 million. But he's an interesting case. He scored 80 points over the last 2 seasons with Arizona and offensively can provide so much, especially in a power play for any NHL team out there. And honestly, considering his status and what could happen, I could see Arizona still getting a couple of solid picks back. But to me, if Edmonton isn't able to snag Erik Karlsson, to me, they'll go immediately to Shane Gostisbehere, and it won't be horrible. I think he'd really fit into that system. Now let's move on to number 6 here, because to me, this is the most underrated player available at this year's trade deadline, and that is another Arizona Coyote, this time though in Nick Bjugstad. And to me, if you're looking for a third line center defensively that can also pitch in a lot in the goal scoring side of things, Bjugstad is pretty much perfect. He's making almost no money at $900K, so he'd be extremely easy to bring on if you're an aspiring team. And this year in 54 games in Arizona has 13 goals, 10 assists for 23 points. And as a fourth line, third line guy for the playoffs, I can see the Bruins, maybe Devils, Rangers, and especially Edmonton Oilers going after him. Now let's go on to number 5, and let's go on to probably the most likely big forward fish to be moved at this year's deadline in Timo Meier. With 1 year left in his contract at $6 million, even though he is an RFA, I would be genuinely shocked if the Sharks end up keeping him. It would just be bad for the future of that franchise. Even though Meier has been a fantastic, brilliant, elite player for them, they need to trade him for the haul they could get. And with 31 goals, 52 points in 55 games this year for San Jose, he just keeps on producing and is also one of the league leaders in hits too, using his body extremely well in all 3 areas of the ice. And to me, he's one of the most efficient players out there and one of the best play drivers too. And to me, some top teams will be after him, including Carolina, New Jersey, and the Bruins. Now let's advance on to one of the most interesting players available at this year's deadline, and to me, the most likely Blackhawks forward to be dealt at this deadline. It's not Patrick Kane or Jonathan Taves, it's Sam Lafferty, who is in an extremely unique position this year. He has a multi-year deal right now at $1.15 million for this year and next, and he's in an interesting position because of his situation and the way he plays. As a fourth line bang and crash player, he's a guy that I think will get a lot of interest from contending teams to be on that bottom six and have his physical job. He's not the most perfect player out there, he's not a great play driver, but I could see him maybe getting a pretty solid mid-round pick for Chicago back. And to me, I think two teams make a lot of sense. One is the Penguins bringing him back onto the roster. I think he'd be really good on that fourth line, as well as the Winnipeg Jets, who don't have a lot of toughness on that bottom six, or at least not consistently, and Lafferty would be a pretty interesting piece come playoff time. And this year in 46 games for Chicago, playing bottom 6 minutes, he has 8 goals, 11 assists for 19 points. But next up, let's move on to number 3 and the third most likely player to be dealt the trade deadline. Let's go on to Vancouver Canucks D-man in Luke Schenn. Now, the Canucks could just decide to be the Canucks and not trade him, but I think now they have traded Bo Horvat, they're going to end up trading Luke Schenn as well, which is absolutely what should happen. He would be a rental making $850K, and as a bottom pair, hardworking, rugged defenseman who can block a lot of shots, Luke Schenn does that exceedingly well, and he's not going to be providing much offense for you, but as a sixth guy, I could see a lot of teams going after him. Mainly the Pittsburgh Penguins, maybe the Boston Bruins, and potentially even the Tampa Bay Lightning bringing him back on again, and I think for the Canucks, maybe getting a late second round pick would be pretty reasonable. But now let's move on to the second Chicago Blackhawk of the list and the second most likely player to be dealt at the trade deadline. Now let's go on to the multi-year deal with defenseman Jake McCabe, who is one of the most interesting and probably one of the more expensive players left at this year's trade deadline because of that term. Right now, he makes $4 million for this year and the next 2 years afterwards, but this year especially has been a resurgence in McCabe's game, being probably the best overall Blackhawks defenseman, especially on defense, with the blocking shots as well as getting into lanes and getting sticks in areas. He's a really consistent and effective defenseman that you don't have to worry about, and I think a lot of teams will want that, not just for this year, but because of that multi-year deal. And I see the Vegas Golden Knights, the Caps, the Penguins, and the Bruins being among the teams out there wanting McCabe, and I think that asking price will be pretty large because of that multi-year deal. If it was just this 1 year, I could see him maybe going for a second and a prospect, but I think a first round pick is where you start the asking price and where you start the negotiations. But now let's go on to the most likely player to be dealt at this year's trade deadline, and notice how I didn't say best, but most likely, because this is the player that I see there almost being no chance that he is not dealt. And let's go on to the St. Louis Blues in Ivan Barbashev. To me, when you talk about cost, when you talk about the cap hit, when you talk about the player itself, there is very few guys out there, and to me, no guys out there that are more likely to be dealt than him. When we look at the player profile, he makes $2.25 million for this year and will be a UFA after, but he's at age 27, right in the heart of his career, and even though his finishing has taken a step back, I think for a lot of teams, as a middle six offensive guy, there's still going to be a ton of interest there. This year in 53 games, he has 10 goals, 17 assists for 27 points, and again, as a middle six guy, I think there's going to be a lot of guys out there that could be worse options. And I also do think the asking price might not be too crazy, likely maybe a second round pick and a C-grade prospect. For that, I see the Devils, the Jets, and the Vegas Golden Knights really attacking for him, but to me, there is almost a 0% chance that he is not gone come trade deadline time. But especially over the past couple weeks for the Blues, losing a ton of games as well as trading Vladimir Tarasenko, and to me, for them, the selling is far from over. But that is my top 10 list. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys agree and disagree with? Who do you think are the most likely guys to be dealt this year's deadline? And where do you see all these players going? And what do you guys think the trades could look like? Let us know down below. Of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell if you haven't already, and share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online. I will see you in the next one. Thank you guys so much for watching today, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a great one, and goodbye.